You don't ignore a warning siren in Tornado Alley, unless someone convinces you it's the problem. The wind hit the house before the first drop of rain did, a low, rolling pressure that made the windows hum like they were holding their breath, and I was already halfway down the hallway when the power flickered once, twice, then settled into that uneasy silence you only notice when everything mechanical suddenly feels fragile, like the whole neighborhood is waiting for permission to panic. My name is Ethan Cole, and I install early warning systems for a living, the kind that give people a few extra minutes when the sky decides to come down sideways, and 3 weeks ago I put a tornado siren on my own property because this stretch of Oklahoma has a history of funnel clouds touching down without much courtesy notice, flat land, open air, nothing to break the rotation once it forms, and I've seen what happens when people rely on phone alerts that come too late or not at all. The siren wasn't pretty. I'll give them that 12 feet of steel mast anchored in concrete, a directional horn. That could carry a tone across half a mile. Painted a dull industrial gray that didn't exactly match the HOA-approved palette of soft beiges and curated landscaping, but it worked, and in my line of work, works is the only category that matters. Linda Haraway didn't see it that way. She saw it from her front porch with a glass of iced tea and a clipboard that might as well have been a badge, the HOA president with a voice that could sound polite and condescending in the same sentence. The kind of person who measures grass height with a ruler and calls it community standards. And the first time she walked up my driveway, I could smell her perfume before I heard her heels on the gravel, sharp and expensive, cutting through the usual mix of cut grass and motor oil that hangs in a place like this. "That thing," she said, not even bothering to call it by name, just pointing at the mast like it offended her personally, "is not compliant with neighborhood guidelines." And I remember wiping my hands on a shop rag, feeling the grit of dried sealant between my fingers, and telling her it was a safety device, not a decoration, something designed to warn people when they had minutes to act instead of seconds. But she smiled that practice smile, the one that says she's already decided how this conversation ends, and said safety didn't excuse disruption, that the noise alone could cause unnecessary panic, that we had systems in place already, phone alerts, local news, community messaging, all the soft, comfortable layers that look good on paper and fail under pressure. The first notice came in a thick envelope with official lettering, a violation for unauthorized exterior installation, followed by a fine that started at $100 and doubled every week it remained unresolved. And then came the meeting, the one where she stood at the front of the clubhouse with a projector slide showing my property outlined in red like a problem to be fixed, explaining how the siren could negatively impact property values, how potential buyers might see it as a sign of danger rather than preparedness. And I sat in the back listening to neighbors nod along because nobody wants to imagine a tornado ripping through their street. It's easier to pretend the risk is theoretical, manageable, something you can regulate with a bylaw. I didn't argue that night, not because I agreed, but because I've learned something from years of watching storms build on radar. Pressure doesn't announce itself loudly at first. It gathers, it shifts, it waits for the right conditions, and arguing with Linda Haraway in a room full of people who wanted comfort over reality wasn't going to change the physics of the atmosphere or the fact that the jet stream had been dipping lower each season. So I went home, checked the mounting bolts on the siren, ran a diagnostic on the control box, and pulled up the latest weather models on my laptop, watching the colors swirl across the screen in patterns that most people wouldn't notice but that, to me, looked like the early sketch of something much bigger, something that didn't care about HOA guidelines or curated lawns. The second notice came with a deadline: remove the siren or face legal action, and the morning after that I found the breaker to the external power line flipped off, not by accident, not by weather, but by a clean, deliberate hand. And that's when I realized this wasn't just about aesthetics anymore, it was about control, about who got to decide what counted as necessary. And as I stood there in the quiet, the mast still, the horn pointed out over a neighborhood that believed silence meant safety, I could feel the air shifting again, that subtle drop in pressure that presses against your ears, the kind of change most people ignore until it's too late. And I remember thinking, not for the first time, that warnings only matter if someone lets them be heard. The next morning the air felt wrong before the sun even cleared the rooftops, that thick, unmoving stillness that settles in like a held breath, and I was standing in my driveway with a multimeter in one hand staring at the dead control box mounted beside the siren mast, the metal still cool from the night air, when I traced the line back to the breaker panel and saw it flipped clean to the off position, not tripped, not weathered, just switched like someone had made a decision for me. I turned it back on and the system hummed to life with that low, reassuring vibration I have trusted for years, A quiet reminder that at least something in this neighborhood still responded to logic, and I did not have to guess who had touched it because Linda Haraway believed in doing things just visible enough to be noticed, just subtle enough to deny, and sure enough her white SUV rolled past 10 minutes later, slow, deliberate, her sunglasses catching the morning light as she gave a tight smile, like we were sharing some private joke. By noon the second envelope was already in my mailbox, thicker than the first, heavier in tone and paper, citing repeated noncompliance, escalating fines now totaling $800, and a new clause about unauthorized mechanical noise devices capable of disturbing the peace. The language polished enough to sound official, vague enough to cover whatever they needed it to cover, and at the bottom her signature sat in bold ink, confident, final, like a stamp of authority she assumed no one would challenge. I set the letter on my workbench beside a set of stainless steel bolts and a half-finished wiring harness and let my eyes drift back to the laptop screen where the latest radar models were updating in slow, hypnotic loops, bands of green and yellow curling tighter over western counties. A pressure line dipping lower than forecast. Subtle shifts that most people would scroll past without a second thought but that, to me, read like a warning written in a language I had spent half my life learning. I pulled up the historical data for this region, cross-referenced seasonal patterns, wind shear values, humidity levels, and there it was again, that familiar alignment of variables that does not guarantee anything but suggests everything, the kind of setup that gives you a narrow window between normal and not, between a quiet evening and something that changes the way people talk about their street for years. Around 3 in the afternoon my phone buzzed with a neighborhood group message. Linda had posted an announcement reminding everyone that unauthorized alarm systems were not permitted and encouraging residents to report disturbances immediately. The replies came in predictable waves, a few agreeing, a few silent, one or two hesitant voices asking about emergency preparedness that were quickly buried under reassurances that official channels would provide all necessary alerts, and I could almost hear the tone in her voice through the text, calm, certain, dismissive of anything that did not fit her version of order. I did not respond. I had already learned that facts sound like opinions to people who have decided otherwise, so instead I walked the perimeter of my yard, checking anchor points, tightening connections, running a manual test that sent a brief pulse through the siren motor without activating the horn, just enough to confirm everything was still aligned, still ready, and then I stepped into the garage where the smell of rubber insulation and machine oil settled into something familiar, grounding, and started pulling components from a storage bin, a sealed battery unit rated for 72 hours, a secondary trigger module I had used on a job outside Tulsa, weatherproof, casing, redundant wiring that could bypass the main line entirely. If they wanted control over the visible system, I could build one they could not reach, something quiet until it needed to be heard, something that did not rely on a single switch in a shared panel. By early evening the sky had taken on that washed-out look, colors flattened, horizon blurred, and the wind shifted just enough to carry a faint metallic tang that always shows up before heavier systems move in, like the air itself is preparing for friction, and I stood there with the last connection tightened, the backup system sealed and tucked beneath the housing, invisible unless you knew exactly where to look, and I let the silence sit for a moment, the neighborhood calm, sprinklers clicking on in neat, scheduled rhythms, distant lawnmowers humming like nothing had changed, while above all of it the atmosphere continued to rearrange itself without asking anyone for permission. And I remember thinking how easy it is to mistake quiet for safety when the only thing missing is the sound that tells you otherwise. By the time the sun dropped behind the line of identical rooftops, the sky had turned that strange, muted shade that never shows up on weather apps, not quite gray, not quite green, just wrong enough to make the back of your neck tighten if you know what you are looking at, and I was standing on my porch with my laptop open, watching the radar loop update every 30 seconds, each frame pulling tighter, cleaner, more organized in a way that storms should not be unless they are building toward something deliberate. The wind had shifted again, steady now out of the southwest at about 20 miles per hour, not gusting, just consistent, like a conveyor belt feeding energy into a system that was still miles away but closing the distance faster than most people would realize. And across the street I could see Linda Haraway adjusting a set of decorative lanterns along her walkway, moving them an inch at a time like precision mattered more than the sky above her. Her phone tucked under her arm, voice carrying just enough for me to catch the tone if not every word, calm, dismissive, the same controlled confidence she had in every meeting, like reality itself needed to comply with her version of order. I checked the local alert systems out of habit. County notifications still listed conditions as watch, not warning. The kind of language that sounds passive until you understand how quickly it can change. And I knew from experience that the gap between those two words is where people lose time, precious minutes that do not come back once the rotation tightens and drops. I walked back inside and flipped on the small weather radio sitting on my kitchen counter. Its static cutting through the quiet before settling into a steady broadcast. The voice on the other end measured, professional, mentioning increased wind shear, possible rotation signatures developing. Nothing urgent yet. Nothing that would make someone leave their dinner or turn off their television, but enough to confirm what I was already seeing on the screen. My eyes moved to the control box mounted near the back door, the main line still active, the backup system hidden beneath it, fully charged, waiting, and I ran through the sequence in my head the same way I had done 100 times on job sites: trigger thresholds, manual override, timing between activation and full output, every step mapped out so there would be no hesitation when it mattered. Outside, a few more neighbors had come out onto their porches, drawn by that subtle pressure in the air that people feel without understanding. Conversations starting in low voices, glances toward the horizon, phones in hands but no real urgency, because there had not been a sound yet to tell them this was different from any other storm that passed through. My phone buzzed again. Another message from the neighborhood group, Linda reminding everyone to remain calm and to rely on official alerts, emphasizing that unauthorized alarm systems could create confusion during weather events. The words careful, almost reassuring, but carrying that same underlying control, and I could not help but notice how many people reacted with simple acknowledgments. Thumbs up, short replies that signaled agreement without thought, because it is easier to trust a familiar voice than an unfamiliar risk. I stepped back onto the porch and looked up, really looked, the cloud base now lower, more defined, a subtle rotation starting to show if you track the movement long enough, like a slow wool turning above the neighborhood, and the wind carried a sharper edge now, a faint hiss through the trees and across the rooftops that replaced the earlier stillness with something more active, more focused. I thought about the breaker switch, about how easily it had been flipped off that morning, how quickly a single decision had silenced a system designed to cut through exactly this kind of moment, and I felt that familiar tightening in my chest, not panic, not fear, just the awareness that comes when preparation meets resistance, when the difference between action and inaction is measured in minutes. I moved back inside and rested my hand on the control panel, fingers hovering over the manual trigger, not pressing it yet, just feeling the slight vibration of the system beneath the casing, alive, ready, while outside the neighborhood continued its routine, porch lights flicking on, garage doors closing, people stepping back indoors as the first distant rumble rolled across the sky. Not loud, not dramatic, just enough to signal that the atmosphere had crossed a line most of them did not even realize existed. And in that moment, with the radar tightening, the wind aligning, and the silence still unbroken by any official alarm, I understood exactly how thin the margin was between knowing and reacting, and how dangerous it becomes when the only warning people are waiting for is the one someone else decided should not exist. The first official alert came too late to matter the way people think alerts should. A flat tone from the weather radio cutting through the kitchen just as the wind outside shifted from steady to restless, rattling the siding in short, uneven bursts, and I watched the radar signature tighten into a hook shape that left very little room for interpretation. The kind of formation you do not debate or wait on, the kind you act on. I pressed the manual trigger and felt the system respond instantly. Beneath my hand, a deep, mechanical vibration building inside the housing as the siren motor spun up, the pitch rising from a low hum to that unmistakable wail designed to cut through walls, through conversations, through denial, and for a brief second it did exactly what it was built to do. The sound rolling across the neighborhood, sharp, clear, impossible to ignore, and I could see porch lights flick on up and down the street as doors opened and people stepped out, looking around, trying to locate the source, confusion giving way to that first flicker of awareness. Then it stopped, cut off so clean it felt unnatural, like a sentence interrupted mid-word, and the silence that followed hit harder than the sound itself because it told me exactly what had happened without me needing to check. Someone had gone back to that breaker and flipped it again. My jaw tightened and I moved fast, not running, just efficient, stepping into the garage and pulling the panel open to confirm what I already knew. The main line dead again, the switch down, deliberate, and I did not waste time flipping it back because the main line was no longer the point. The backup system was, so I reached under the housing, found the concealed trigger and pressed it, feeling the independent circuit engage with a softer, more contained vibration that built into the same rising tone seconds later, the siren coming back to life stronger this time, sustained, its sound carrying farther now that the wind had picked up, slicing through the growing noise outside. I stepped back out onto the porch and saw the difference immediately. Neighbors no longer standing still but moving, some heading toward their garages, others pulling children inside. A few looking up at the sky with expressions that had shifted from curiosity to something sharper, more focused, and across the street Linda Haraway stood frozen for a moment, phone in her hand, eyes scanning as if trying to decide whether this was still something she could control. Then she turned abruptly and disappeared inside her house. My own phone vibrated in my pocket. A call this time, not a message, and when I glanced at the screen it showed an unknown number with the same local prefix as the HOA office. I let it ring, listening instead to the siren doing its job, steady, relentless, because answering would not change the physics unfolding above us. The wind surged again, stronger now, pushing loose debris across driveways, the trees bending in a way that told me the inflow was strengthening, feeding into something just beyond our line of sight, and the sky had taken on that deeper, heavier tone, layers moving at different speeds, different directions, all of it aligning into a system that had crossed from possibility into reality. The weather radio crackled with an updated bulletin, the voice no longer measured but urgent, confirming rotation detected, advising immediate shelter, the words finally matching what the siren had already been saying, and I could not help the small, tight exhale that left my chest, not relief, just recognition of timing, of how close the gap had been between awareness and action. A sudden knock echoed from somewhere down the street, a door slammed, a car engine revved then cut off, the ordinary sounds of a neighborhood shifting into something else entirely, and I kept my hand near the backup control, monitoring the output, making sure the tone held steady because consistency matters when people are deciding whether to move or wait. In the distance, just beyond the row of houses at the end of the block, I saw the first clear sign, not dramatic, not towering, just a subtle lowering of the cloud base. Tightening column of movement that should not be there, like a shadow forming where no shadow belonged, and the wind responded immediately, changing pitch, carrying a low, continuous roar that you feel as much as you hear. And in that moment every choice made over the past 3 weeks lined up in my mind with a clarity that did not need explanation. The letters, the fines, the breaker flipped off, the insistence on silence, all of it leading to this exact point where the only thing cutting through the noise was the system someone had tried to remove. And as the siren held its steady call over the neighborhood, I watched people finally move with purpose. Not because they trusted me, not because they understood the data, but because something loud enough had told them they could not afford to wait any longer. The roar built in layers, not sudden, not explosive, but steady and growing, like a freight train miles away that you realize is not passing by but coming straight toward you. And the siren held its tone over it all, cutting through the rising noise with a consistency that grounded the moment. Something predictable in a situation that was quickly losing anything that felt controlled. I stepped back inside and moved down the short hallway toward the reinforced door at the end. The one most people in this neighborhood treated like an unnecessary upgrade when they toured the house. A storm shelter built below grade with poured concrete walls and a steel latch that closed with a solid final sound, and I pulled it open, flipped on the interior light, and checked the basics out of habit: water, first aid kit, battery radio, all in place already, because preparation is not about panic. It is about removing decisions when time disappears. Outside, the wind surged again, harder now, pushing against the structure with a force that made the frame creak in short, sharp pulses, and I could hear objects moving across driveways. Light things first, trash bins, loose patio chairs, the small, hollow impacts that tell you the environment is starting to rearrange itself. The siren continued without interruption, the backup system holding steady exactly as designed, and I glanced once more at the control panel before stepping back toward the front of the house, drawn by the change in sound outside, a deeper, more continuous rush that replaced the earlier gusts with something more sustained. When I opened the door, the air hit me immediately, thick, charged, carrying a fine mist that was not quite rain yet, just enough moisture to make the pavement shine under the porch light, and the sky had lowered further, the base now visibly rotating if you fixed your eyes on a single point and tracked it for more than a second, the motion subtle but undeniable, like a slow-turning wheel. Above the street, a car rolled past at low speed, headlights on, driver leaning forward over the wheel as if getting closer to the windshield would make things clearer. Then it stopped abruptly 2 houses down as the driver seemed to reconsider. Reverse lights flickering on before the vehicle backed into a driveway and the engine cut. The decision made to stay rather than try to outrun something that was already too close. I heard a door slam nearby, then another, the neighborhood shifting fully into response mode now, the earlier hesitation replaced by movement, and across the street. Linda's front door opened again, this time not with the composed control she usually carried but with a sharper motion. Her silhouette framed in the doorway for a second as she looked up at the sky, then toward the source of the siren, her posture rigid, uncertain, like she was recalculating something that no longer followed her rules. The wind intensified again, a strong, sustained push that pressed against my chest and carried a low, continuous sound that vibrated through the ground as much as the air, and at the far end of the block, just beyond the last row of houses, the rotation dipped lower, not dramatic, not a towering funnel, just a tightening column that connected motion in the clouds to motion on the ground in a way that removed any remaining doubt. I stepped back inside and closed the door firmly, the latch clicking into place, then moved quickly but without rushing toward the shelter again, because this was the point where timing mattered more than observation, where watching turned into acting. The siren still cut through everything, steady, relentless, and I could hear footsteps outside on the porch now, quick, uneven, followed by a sharp knock that echoed through the entryway, not polite, not measured, just urgent, and I paused for half a second with my hand on the shelter door, listening to the knock come again, louder this time, layered over the rising sound of the storm, and in that brief space between one impact and the next I understood exactly what had changed, not the weather, not the system, but the perception of it, the shift from something to control to something to survive. And as the knock came again, more insistent, I turned back toward the front door, already knowing who was on the other side and why they were there. The knock came again, harder this time, sharp against the wood like it was trying to break through the noise outside, and I crossed the room in 3 quick steps, unlocking the door just enough to pull it open against the pressure of the wind. And there she was, Linda Haraway, standing on my porch with her hair pulled loose from whatever careful style she had started the evening with, strands whipping across her face as she tried to keep her balance, her phone still in one hand but forgotten. Now screen dark, no longer the center of control it had been an hour ago. The air rushed in around her, carrying that deep, layered sound that had grown from a distant rumble into something constant, something that filled every space between thoughts, and for a second neither of us said anything, just stood there in that narrow frame of light and shadow, the siren still cutting across the neighborhood behind her, steady and unbroken. "You need to turn it back on," she said, her voice raised, but not in command anymore, more urgent than anything I had heard from her before. The words coming out fast like she was trying to catch up to something already moving past her. And I could not help the slight pause before I answered, not out of hesitation, but because the statement itself no longer matched reality. "It is on," I said, keeping my voice level, the same tone I use when explaining system functions to clients who expect everything to be simple, and her eyes flicked past me into the house as if looking for confirmation, then back toward the mast visible over the edge of the porch, the horn angled toward the street, still sending out that unwavering call. The wind surged again, pushing against both of us, and she stepped forward instinctively, crossing the threshold without waiting for an invitation. The shift in her posture immediate, from authority to need, from control to reaction, and I stepped back to give her space, already turning toward the hallway because there was no time to stand here and explain anything that should have been obvious. "You shut it off earlier," I added as I moved, not accusatory, just factual, the words placed the same way I would log an issue in a report, and I heard her inhale sharply behind me, a quick, tight sound that could have been denial or realization. I did not turn to check which. The house creaked again under a stronger gust, a deeper flex in the frame that told me the system outside was tightening further, and the air pressure shifted just enough to make my ears pop, that subtle internal signal that things were changing fast. "We need to go. Downstairs?" I said, opening the shelter door fully now, the light inside casting a steady, contained glow that contrasted with the movement everywhere else, and she hesitated for half a second at the top of the short stairwell, looking down into the reinforced space like it was something foreign, something she had never considered needing, and then another surge of wind rattled the windows hard enough to snap that hesitation cleanly in half. She moved past me quickly, stepping down into the shelter with less grace than she would have liked, one hand brushing the wall to steady herself, and I followed, pulling the door closed behind us and setting the latch with a firm motion that sealed out the shifting air and replaced it with a quieter, contained stillness broken only by the muffled continuation of the siren above. For a moment we stood there in that small, solid space, the difference in sound immediate, the chaos outside reduced to a distant, low presence, and she looked at me. Again, this time without the practiced composure, her expression searching, recalibrating, trying to align what she was experiencing with what she had insisted was unnecessary. "I thought the alerts would be enough," she said. Not quite a question, not quite a statement, just something that needed to be said out loud, and I leaned back against the wall, arms relaxed, breathing steady, because this was the part where explanation no longer mattered, only outcome. Above us, the structure absorbed. Another long, sustained push of wind, the sound stretching across the ceiling like a drawn breath, and through it all the siren continued, filtered now but unmistakable, a constant reminder of the system she had tried to silence and the reason we were both standing here instead of somewhere else, somewhere less prepared, and I watched her listen to it, really listen this time, not as a nuisance, not as a violation, but as the one thing cutting through everything else, and in that quiet, reinforced space with the storm fully arriving overhead, the shift in her understanding was as clear as the shift in the air had been hours earlier, subtle at first, then impossible to ignore once it crossed a certain point. The shelter settled into a steady quiet that felt almost unnatural compared to the chaos pressing down from above. A low, distant roar filtered through layers of concrete and steel, constant now, no longer rising or falling but holding at a level that told me the system had fully committed, and Linda stood a few feet away from me, her back against the wall, one hand still gripping her phone like it might start working again if she held it tight enough. Her breathing, uneven at first before it began to slow as the reality of being inside something solid took over. The light overhead cast a soft, even glow across the space, no flicker, no variation, just steady illumination that made everything feel smaller, more contained, and I could see her eyes moving around the room, taking in details she had never cared about before, the reinforced hinges on the door, the thick bolts along the frame, the compact shelves stocked with supplies that had always looked excessive to people who assumed worst-case scenarios were theoretical. The siren continued above us, muted but unmistakable, its rhythm consistent, almost mechanical in its certainty, and I watched her react to it differently now, not flinching, not annoyed, but listening, aligning her sense of what was happening outside with that sound, finally understanding its purpose without needing it explained. Another long push of wind moved across the structure, deeper this time, the kind that makes the entire house shift just enough to feel it through your feet, and she closed her eyes for a second, not in fear exactly, but in acknowledgement, like her body was catching up to what her mind had been resisting for weeks. "How long does this last?" she asked, her voice lower now, stripped of that controlled tone she carried in meetings, and I glanced at the small weather radio on the shelf, its speaker crackling softly with intermittent updates, then back at her. "It depends on the cell," I said, keeping it simple. "Could be a few minutes, could be longer, the important part is that we are already where we need to be." And she nodded once, a short, tight motion that carried more weight than any agreement she had given before, because this one was not about policy or preference, it was about accepting a situation she could not adjust with a vote or a letter. Above us, the sound shifted slightly, a change in tone more than volume, the kind that signals movement, the system passing over or just to the side, and I listened carefully, years of experience translating those subtle differences into a mental map of what was happening outside. The direction of the wind, the speed of the rotation, the way the pressure felt against the structure. She followed my gaze to the ceiling as if she could read the same information there, then looked back at me, something unspoken in her expression, a question that did not need to be formed into words because the answer was already present in the moment. The siren held steady, still cutting through everything, still doing exactly what it had been designed to do, and I thought back to the breaker switch, to the clean, deliberate motion of it being turned off, the confidence behind that action, and how quickly that confidence had unraveled once the environment stopped cooperating with the narrative built around it. The radio voice sharpened briefly, confirming rotation in the immediate area, advising continued shelter, and then faded back into static between updates, and I saw her tighten her grip on the phone again before letting it relax slightly, the habit of control meeting the limits of the situation. Time stretched in that space, not in minutes. But in sensations, the rhythm of the siren, the filtered rush of wind, the steady light above us, all of it blending into a kind of suspended moment where nothing external could be influenced, only endured, and I stayed still, breathing evenly because movement would not change anything now, preparation already had. Eventually the sound above began to shift again, not disappearing, but easing, the constant pressure breaking into uneven pulses, then longer gaps, the system moving on the way they always do, leaving behind a different kind of quiet, one that feels heavier because of what just passed through it, and I glanced toward the door, listening for the change to settle, waiting for the moment when it was no longer safer to stay than to step back into the world outside. And across from me Linda followed that same shift, her posture adjusting, her shoulders lowering slightly as the tension that had been holding her rigid started to release, and in that shared silence, with the siren still echoing faintly above and the storm moving beyond us, the difference between what she had believed and what she had just experienced settled into something that did not need to be argued, only understood. When the pressure finally eased enough to feel the difference in my chest instead of just hearing it in the structure, I reached for the latch and held it for a second, listening past the last uneven pulses of wind, the kind that trail off after a system moves through, not gone, but no longer centered over you, and the siren above shifted with it, still running but now carrying farther, its tones stretching into the distance instead of pressing straight down on us. I opened the door slowly, and the first thing that hit me was the air, cooler, damp, carrying the smell of wet earth and splintered wood, that sharp, clean scent that follows heavy rotation, and the light outside had changed, not dark anymore but washed out, like the color had been pulled from everything and replaced with a pale, flat gray. Linda stepped up behind me without saying anything, and we moved back into the main part of the house, the floor steady underfoot, the walls intact, everything exactly where it had been, and that contrast alone told me how narrowly the core had missed us. I crossed to the front door and opened it fully this time, the hinges creaking softly, and the street beyond looked like the same. Place arranged by different rules, small things out of position, bins tipped over, branches scattered across lawns, patio furniture shifted into places it had not been before, and further down the block, toward the end where the rotation had dipped lowest, the change was more obvious, lines not as straight, edges not as clean, rooftops interrupted where they had been continuous earlier. The siren continued to sound above it all, no longer urgent in the same way but still present, a steady reminder that the system was active until manually reset, and I stepped out onto the porch, scanning the sky out of habit, the cloud base lifting now, rotation dissipating into broader movement as the cell pushed east. Linda followed a step behind me and stopped at the top of the stairs, her gaze fixed down the street where the visual differences were hardest to ignore, and for a moment she did not move at all, just stood there taking it in, the reality of what had passed translating through sight instead of sound. A car door opened somewhere to the right, then another, neighbors emerging cautiously, voices low, calling out to each other, checking, confirming, the normal language of a community shifting into something more deliberate, more aware. I reached up and flipped the cutoff on the backup system, the siren winding down in a controlled fade, the tone dropping in pitch before settling into silence that felt heavier now because of what had filled it moments earlier. And that quiet spread outward, revealing the smaller sounds beneath it, water dripping from eaves, distant engines, the rustle of leaves still moving in the leftover wind. Linda exhaled slowly, a long, measured breath like she had been holding it without realizing, and when she spoke her voice carried none of the sharp edges it usually did. "It would have been completely quiet," she said, more to herself than to me, the words landing with a weight that did not need emphasis. I nodded once, not adding anything because the statement was accurate on its own, and explanations at this point would only dilute what she was already understanding. We stood there for another few seconds, watching as more people stepped out, some looking up at the siren, others looking down the street where the impact was more visible, and I could see the connection forming in their expressions, the sequence of events aligning in a way that did not require technical knowledge, just basic cause and effect. Linda turned slightly, her eyes moving from the street back to the mast on my property, then to the control box mounted beside it, the same one she had pointed at weeks ago as a problem to be removed, and there was a pause in her movement, a recalibration that did not show up as a gesture or a statement, just a subtle shift in how she held herself. "I had them shut off the breaker," she said finally, the admission quiet, direct, not framed as justification or defense, just a fact placed into the space between us, and I met her gaze for a second, the same way I would acknowledge any piece of information in a report without reaction, because the consequence of that action had already played out in a way neither of us needed to describe. Down the block someone called out that everyone was accounted for, another voice answered, and the neighborhood began to move again, slowly returning to something familiar but not quite the same. The kind of shift that stays with a place long after the sky clears. And as the last of the storm moved off and the siren sat silent above us, the difference between what had been considered necessary and what had been considered optional settled into something much harder to ignore than any sound ever could be. The neighborhood did not return to normal all at once. It never does after something like that. It comes back in layers, small sounds first, doors opening and closing, voices carrying across yards, engines starting, then stopping again as people realize there is nowhere urgent to go anymore, just things to look at, things to process, and I stayed on the porch longer than most, not because I needed to but because I wanted to see how the shift settled, how a place recalibrates after the illusion of control gets replaced by something more grounded. The sky continued to lighten as the storm moved farther east, the heavy cloud base breaking apart into uneven patches that let strips of pale sunlight through, and that light fell across the street in a way that made every change stand out sharper, every misplaced object, every interrupted line, every reminder that the environment had rewritten parts of the neighborhood in a matter of minutes. Linda had not moved far. She stood at the edge of my walkway now, no longer centered in the scene the way she usually positioned herself, just another resident looking at the same street with the same set of questions. And when a couple from 2 houses down walked over, checking on her, their tone careful but direct, she answered without the usual polished phrasing, just simple acknowledgments. Yes, she was fine. Yes, she had taken shelter. Yes, she had heard the siren. I stepped down off the porch and moved toward the control box, flipping the main breaker back into alignment with the backup system, restoring the full circuit the way it was meant to run, the switch settling into place with a small, solid click. That felt more significant now than it had that morning, and I left it there, no hesitation, no consideration of alternatives, because the decision had already been tested under the only conditions that mattered. As I turned back, a few more neighbors had gathered along the curb, talking in low voices, pointing down the block where the changes were most visible, and I could see them glance toward the siren, not with annoyance, not with skepticism, but with a kind of recognition that comes when something proves its value without needing explanation. Linda watched me for a moment, then took a few steps closer, stopping just short of the porch again. Her posture different now, not smaller exactly, but less rigid, like she was no longer bracing against something that had already passed. "There will be a meeting," she said, her voice steady but quieter than before, the words carrying none of the authority they once did, just a statement of what comes next in a place like this, and I nodded once, not because I needed the meeting but because I understood the process, how communities try to reassert structure after it has been challenged by something they cannot regulate. "The guidelines will need to be updated," she added after a second, and there was a pause there, a small but noticeable space where her usual certainty would have filled in details, requirements, enforcement, but this time it remained open, undefined, and I met her gaze briefly before looking back toward the street. "They will," I said, keeping it simple because anything more would have been unnecessary, the outcome already written in what we had both just experienced. A truck rolled slowly past at the end of the block, someone checking on a neighbor, and a few people waved, small gestures that carried more weight now, the kind that come easier after a shared moment that strips away some of the distance between houses. I walked back toward the porch and rested my hand lightly against the siren mast, feeling the faint residual warmth in the metal from the motor that had been running, the system quiet now but ready, always ready, because that is the point, not to wait for permission, not to fit within someone's idea of acceptable, but to function when the conditions demand it. Behind me, conversations continued, plans forming, cleanup, insurance calls, the practical next steps that follow every event like this, but none of it changed the core truth that had settled over the street along with the fading storm. I looked out once more at the line of houses, at the subtle differences that marked where the system had touched down and where it had